Hello. So we're going to get started on painting the lime here. We're going to first, I always paint with some paper towels, so I'm going to go ahead and grab a few paper towels off of there. Lay this aside. I've got my number 10 brush and my 1-inch brush. I could have a smaller number 4 in here, a number 4 round if I thought I needed it. I don't know that I will. But this is what I'm going to be using. We got the drawing over here, as far as that goes. And I've got my water just off the screen here. I've got my palette of colors. And we're going to go ahead and jump right on into this. Now the back wall, again, we're just doing that to basically simplify this thing and to give it a little bit more interest. That way we'll have 3 areas of color: the wall, the lime, and the table. So what we're going to do first is I'm going to mix up. Now I'm going to have the wall be sort of an off-white. It would be a little bit back in shadow, so we're probably going to be somewhere between about a step 9 or step 8, somewhere on the value scale. Since it's going to be since it's going to be a wall and it's going to be an ivory, it's going to be very neutral. So I'm going to mix my Payne's gray and my brown together. This is too dark, so we're going to lighten that up. And then I want just a touch of yellow, because it's a yellow-orange light, which means it's going to add a little bit of yellow-orange to the wall. And so this right here, and if I wanted to, I could take this and I could go ahead and put some of it on the cloth to check the color. Or not the cloth, this is my paper towel. Just to check the color real quick, and I think that's about what I want. Now, I'm going to go ahead and after I had that piece of paper that was sized a little strange, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put down an initial wash. Now this wall is so light that I'm probably just going to darken it just a tiny little bit, but I'm going to use my brush. It's got a little paint in it, not to worry. I think I'm going to get over here with my bigger brush, and I'm going to go ahead and start to cut in. I need a nice straight line there, and the biggest brush I could stand to use, especially if it's a flat, that makes a nice chisel straight line. Again, we're just going to start washing this in. I have to be very careful that I don't let anything, like if I left this too long, that'll create a water line. We don't want that. So we're constantly trying to push this forward. Remember, we have no more than 10 minutes on any one area at the most. And so I need to really move it. All right, I got about 3/4 of the way. I come back in here and cut around there. I need a nice clean line for the edge of the table, right about there. Right about there. Bring this up. Okay. Now the nose, I need something to cut around the nose. It's a little easier to cut around that nose with this number 10 round brush. I don't want it too small. So again, there we go. Cut around the nose on this thing, on this guy. And I want to come over here and make sure I've got a little area here that needs a little more attention. There was a couple dry little specks of white over there that we did not need. Now that's nice and neutral, and I can go ahead and add, this is basically, we're just doing a flat wash, and I'm just going to cut in around this once again, and I'm doing this to add a little more paint on one side than the other, as far as that goes. Okay. And I'm not using all this area up here because it just doesn't make any sense. So I decided just to stay as close around the lime as possible. I think I want a little color in here. We have that it's, again, this wall. We have to make sure we don't add too much yellow to this, or it's going to look like the wall has jaundice or something. We don't want that. So we're going to go ahead and add just the tiniest little bit of yellow to our mixture, just so we get a hint of it. Because again, we want it very neutral. We don't want it to start to look like the wall has some sort of disease or something of that nature. It's just, so we're gonna go ahead and cut around this with just a little bit of color. And again, I could go ahead and darken it over here if I need to, and I could bring a little bit of more of the blue from the Payne's gray into it if I wanted to. Again, just to keep it nice and neutral, so it'll look like it's getting darker as it comes to the right. So this is another way of creating the gradation. Start with the lightest value and then just start floating in the darker and darker and darker values, and you'll have a gradation. So I'm going to go ahead and darken just a little bit more, bring a little bit more of this Payne's gray, which will darken this. It also add a slight bit of blue, so that as the light moves away from this object, there's less of that. I said it was a yellow-orange light, so there's less of the yellow-orange, so that means it's going to be going into shadow, and usually it'll go towards its complement, so we'll put a little blue in there, and that will make it seem like there's more light over here and less light over here, and that's what we're looking for. All right. So this again is just basically a modified flat wash. We started with a flat wash, then we floated some that was slightly darker and duller, and then we floated some more that was slightly duller and darker. And what we've done is we've taken that flat wash, and by floating these darker shapes into it with gradations, well, by floating these smaller and smaller areas that are darker, we now have a gradation, I guess is the way to say that. So now we've started with a flat wash and we've turned that flat wash into a gradated wash. A little different than we did on the techniques page, but certainly a valid way to create a gradation. So we're going to go ahead and let this dry down, and then we're going to deal with the cast shadow. All right, so we'll come back to that in just a minute. All right, so we're going to continue on here. We're going to go ahead and clean the palette up a little bit, and we're going to deal with the cast shadow. Now the cast shadow is between a step 5 and a step 6 on the value scale. Since the light again is yellow, we're going to be looking for, and it's yellow orange, so its complement would be blue violet. Lo and behold, this Payne's gray has a little bit of a blue violet nature to it. So again, it's going to be neutral. It's going to be on the bluer side. People will talk about blue shadows. Well, it depends on what the light source is. But this one will be sort of a bluer shadow sort of thing. I'm going to be using my round, my number 10. I'm going to start to wash this in. Now I'm going to make a gradation by starting with the lightest. So first off, I'll go ahead and start to fill in the shape for our shadow. We're just going to continue filling this in. Again, this will be my lightest value. And again, it's going to be sort of like a flat wash. We're not trying to vary it too much. And remember, with a flat wash, you always want to use the biggest brush you can possibly use for to make a flat wash. The biggest brush you can possibly stand to use. The smaller the brush, the more variegated, or the more, the more texture there will be in your wash. So there's always the idea that you use the biggest brush you can possibly stand to use on this thing. And so that's what we're going to be doing here as we're making our painting. We're going to be using the biggest brush we can possibly stand to deal with, stand to use. So I'm going to go ahead and continue to cut this in. Just going to be carefully using this number 10 round to make our wash here, our flat wash. I'm choked up on a little bit too much. I need to actually hold further back. It's easier to get a beautiful line when you're, now I've got a little it was a little irregular just on one point, so I was getting choked up on this just to see if I could fill in just that little bit of the line there. All right, so we went ahead and let's re-wet some of this. Again, try to make this as uniform and uniformly wet so that we get a decent shadow out of it. All right, so now what we're gonna do is we're gonna take and we're gonna put a little more paint in here and we're gonna float this. We're not gonna fill the whole part of it. We're just gonna fill in where it gets a little closer to the lime. Also, usually shadows are darker and lighter as they go back. So I'm gonna extend it a little bit further on the front side. And bring a little bit more of this underneath the lime. So now we have light, medium, and then we're going to go ahead and put a little bit more in for the dark. And so I'm going to go ahead and fill this part of the shadow in with a little bit more dark. Again, to give us a gradation. Again, I'm dropping in. The reason I drop in is because a lot of times to make things a little darker and to control a gradation, you can drop into it, and it's a nice way of deepening that area. So again, now that we've got this, we're going to have dark, medium, and light, dark, medium, and light on that shadow. We have a gradation very, very quickly. All right. And I could even let this water evaporate a little bit more, and then using a dry brush or a semi-wet brush on semi-wet paper, I could make it even darker if I so chose. But now we have the wall, we have the cast shadow, and for this one again, we're gonna leave the cloth white for now. And once this dries, we're gonna come back in and we're gonna start to paint the lime. So go ahead and start to fill in. And the reason I jumped down to the cast shadow is because it's not touching the wall. All right, I could do the wall and then I could do this, and because they're not touching, I don't have to worry about them bleeding into one another. Now, sometimes people are, when you're first starting a watercolor, we have a little bit of variation. It didn't have this nice clean line all the way around. Well, when we're painting the green, we can bring the green up over this line, because the green will be darker. We can make that line clean by using the darker line of the green. So anyways, it's not a big worry yet. So we're gonna go ahead and let this dry down, and then we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna paint the lime. All right, so we'll come back once this is dried. That way everything around the lime will be dry and we can start painting that, no problems, no issues. And we'll continue our painting adventure. All right, so we're gonna continue on. We're gonna paint the lime. So let's go ahead and get on with that. I'm gonna go ahead and first I'm going to clean up the palette just a little bit, get some of this paint out of the way. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to start by, again, we're going to wet this down a little bit with a wash. I think I was working in that, I've got this blue left behind from when I was working the shadows, so you want to make sure you get that good and washed out, and any excess color as much as you can. Now there's certain colors you might have to go wash your brush with soap and water, but this should be fine for this. Now this is a lime, so I'm going to start with the yellow that's more of a lemony yellow, or in other words a slight yellow green, a lemony yellow. And because that's the closest to green, therefore when we mix our greens it'll be brighter. So much different greens than if we used this yellow over here. That would give us all of the sorts of greens, very dull greens, because they're further apart. So remember, whenever we're mixing those hues, we use the colors that are closer to what we're trying to match, or the color we're trying to create. If we're trying to create green, start with the yellow that's greener. So I'm going to take this and let's go ahead and just start Now the good thing about this, the good news about this, is that since I have a lime and it's going to be green, it's not a big deal that I have this yellow undertone. Some artists will tell you to always do this. And I'm one of those that be like, well, it's never a bad idea. It's not the only idea, but it's never a bad idea. So again, we've got 10 minutes, so we want to make sure. Now, I can always re-wet this because I'm trying to make sure that I get as close to filling in those lines or tracing the outside contour of this lime as close as possible. So that we can, make sure that the water, the paint will flow. It won't go beyond where the water is. So we want that nice water line to be just as lovely and follow our graphite line as close as possible. Why wouldn't we? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and now I can just fill in the rest. And I'm going to kind of also re-wet the paper if it's starting to get semi-wet or starting to dry out. By re-wetting even next to it, it'll flow into that area. So I'm just going to make sure it's good and wet over this whole area. Now I just forgot to do something, which is never a good idea, but I have to deal with it now. I didn't leave the highlight. So I'm going to blot it. And if I was really worried about it, I'd let this whole thing dry down before I went to the next part, but I'm not going to stress it too much. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to start laying in our lightest color. So I'm going to start with, I'm using my ultramarine blue because the one thing about greens, if we're not careful, is they can get too bright, like fluorescent green or chemical green as some people will call it, and we don't want that. So I'm using a blue that's a little further away from green. You might be like, I thought we always use the colors are closest. The reason we don't with this green, because if we used like phthalo blue, which is a blue-green, even if we use cerulean blue, we can just, and I'm using a little bit of cerulean blue because this blue-violet was a little bit too far. But we just don't want it to be too bright. We have to be very careful that it doesn't get too bright when we start laying it in. So this will be my light values. This is what we're going to lay in right now for our lime. So there's my light values. Lay that in, let it flow a little bit. Now we're going to darken down for our middle values. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start to darken this. I'm going to start adding a little Payne's Gray. Because I've added a little bit of Payne's Gray, I don't have to worry quite so much about using phthalo blue or the it's not manganese blue, that's a cerulean blue, or blue greens. And I do want to, again, keep it on the little yellower. This was a little bluer. This is a little more yellow to it. And again, we're going to start to add some of this in here for, again, our middle values. Trying to stay on top of use that water tension, stay on top of using a very light stroke so that the paint stays on top of the water. So, bring this down. Then we have our darker middle values. And darken this a little bit more. Come through here. Again, this lime is really dark. That's kind of one of the harder things when we first start painting, is not having everything look like it's washy and blown out and such. Remember, I've only got about 10 minutes, so I've got to hurry up with this, but I just realized, I just think this needs a little bit more. This was too much, but it needed a little more yellow, so I'm dropping in the yellow. And that way, if I don't have time to come in here, at least I'll have a little more of the paint there that I think needs to be there. I could bring some of the green over the top, so we just have a little bit more. All right, so And again, a lot of times I'll do this dropping in just to introduce a little speck of color, a little bit of color in this area. I said a speck or a little minute bit of color. All right, let's go ahead and start putting in the darks. Now I'm going to wash in the sort of the lightest darks for this, and so I'm going to go ahead. I grabbed a little bit of the blue-green, phthalo green. Again, because there is some ultramarine blue in here, I can do that. If there was no ultramarine blue, I wouldn't. That's too bright. I'd use cerulean instead. But I'm going to start to put in, that's not dark enough, so I'm going to darken a little bit more with the Payne's Gray. Remember, we darken our greens with Payne's Gray. That's how we make them darker. So we're going to darken this up. Now this will be the lightest lights in the shadow family. That's an important thing to remember. So these are our lightest lights in our shadows. Isn't that? Okay, so there we go. Then we're going to go ahead and darken this even more. So I'm going to take a little bit more of our blue. I'm going to take some of our green because that yellow is going to start to lighten our mixture. And so I'm going to grab some of my green here. This will be darker than the yellow. The yellow will lighten this slightly, so we're using the green because it will be darker, already darker. And so I can darken it even more with the Payne's Gray. So we have what we call our dark values. And I'm using a little bit of the Viridian, a little bit of our Hooker's Green, which is really dark. And again, this can help us for these really dark, deep values that we have here on the lime. And again, this is for our dark values. These are darker than the reflected light. So again, this will be my reflected light, so I'm going to leave that alone. And I'm going to make what's around that reflected light darker. All right, fair enough. So again, we've got our reflected light through there. Using a lot of dropping in to move the paint and to pick up some more paint. I can drop in through there a little more. Okay. All right. Now, I'm going to use a little bit more of the Hooker's Green because it's really dark. I'm going to use a little bit of the Payne's Gray because it's really dark. And we're going to put in the core shadow. So again, now we're going to go ahead and lay in the core shadow on our lime. Very, very dark. Something about like that. I'm going to lighten this a little bit to go for the darker middle values. Transition this, I'm going to drop it in. Make it look just like, I'm going to bring a little more yellow into light. And this also a little bit of, this yellow will lighten this slightly. I'm going to use this for, again, some of the, as we go again into those middle values. Through here. Right. Like so. Now this is really wet. Okay, so again, we're just get some Hooker's Green is the name of that green. It's a very dark green. It was used by a very prominent European artist, and he made the color famous. His last name was Hooker. I can't remember his first name, but for those of you who are kind of curious, like, well, that's a strange name. So yeah, it's from a particular artist that would use this all the time in his watercolors, and it's a wonderful color. So much so that, again, they named the color after him. That used to be the epitome of it. You know you'd made it when they started naming colors after you. Back in the art world, back in the day. And there were certain artists that would use certain colors all the time, and again, there used to be some named after Turner, William Millard Turner, and things like that, who also did watercolor as well as oil, a master of the craft. Lots of people, you know. that they had, colors that they used a lot. And so anyways, so again, I'm actually using straight Payne's gray now. I'm dropping it in here, and again, this is for the core shadow. And I'm doing a lot of this dropping, especially in the darkest, because it'll stay, if it's wet enough, it'll soften enough that it'll just sort of fade very gently. And it's a really great technique. So I'm going just a little bit more. I'm getting to the point where I need to leave this alone. Now again, the hardest thing to do is to paint objects that are really dark like this. And it's mostly because, to get your paint really dark, you can't have too much water in there. And again, this is really wet, so we've gotten this about as dark as I can go for right now. And it looks really dark, but this is going to lighten by about 20% everywhere. And so we're going to end up with something that's not all that, no, it's going to still be on the medium dark side, but it's going to lighten. These darks are going to lighten considerably. And we might have to go over it a second time, but that's all right. I'm working just the edges. There's a couple of the edges where it's just a little bit getting lighter because of the way it's spreading, because of how wet this is. Again, I'm using the Hooker's green. I'm just bringing this around the edge. I don't want it to go everywhere because I don't want it to start to look like a cartoon, but there's just a couple places. Like I'm going to lighten this up and go a little bit bluer over here, and I'm going to continue some of this, but it's a little lighter. So it's this idea that I'm just sort of barely scooting that water around. Now, because it's round enough, it picks up its own cast shadow. I don't think I'm going to be able to get away with doing that right now. I can do it on a second layer, or if I'm like, well, second layer, I mean, I can wait till it dries and then put another layer over it. Or I can try to see if I can get this just dark enough. Now, this is the hard part. I'm using a dry brush, essentially, going into a wet wash, so it will spread a little bit. And I'm using Payne's gray and Hooker's green. And again, it's just a dark green, so you're gonna use whatever you got. If I had to mix it, let's say I didn't have that. Well, I might say, well, all right, if I don't have that, I can take my darkest blue, which would be a phthalo blue. So I can take that phthalo blue, I can mix it with a yellow ochre, because the yellow ochre is a little darker. This will lighten it more than this. This will still lighten it too, but it's not as much as the brighter yellows. Okay, so you see how that yellow ochre lightened that, and then we're going to darken this by, remember, between burnt umber and Payne's gray is, it'll neutralize stuff. We can also use between green and brown as the yellow spectrum. This is pushing that back down. Again, that initial yellow lightened this considerably, but I can darken it with, again, Payne's gray and this phthalo blue. And again, now I've got this very, very dark, rich color. And I can use that dark, rich color. Now it's spreading too much, so I took the water out of my brush, and I'm just gonna sort of trim that because it was spreading. Now my brush is thirsty, so it's pulling off a white line over there. I don't want that. So I'm going to reload my brush. I'm going to take some of the paint out so I have a semi-wet brush, and I'm just going to put some paint right down where it was creating that white stripe. I might need to put a little more in there. I'm just dropping it in, letting it, there's still enough water that it can spread a tiny bit. And now I'm going to go ahead and leave this alone. Oh, yeah, I'm going to leave it alone. I was going to say, every time I do this, I go, because I get in this sort of, like this oil painting frame of mine where you have a little more leniency. You don't in watercolor. I may wish I hadn't done this. No, there's still, okay, there's still enough water I can do this. But this is going into shadow underneath here, so I need to bring this nose, bring in just a little bit of watercolor just to show that, yeah, this is the shadow side of the underside of this little, the nose or protrusion or whatever we want to call it for this this lime. We can also take a little bit of this, and there's a middle value around here that gets a little darker. Maybe a little darker still, so we'll take a little bit more of the paint, bring this in for that middle value. Like that. And then there's a little sort of a depression in here, so it's going to get a tiny bit darker right about through here. That's probably too dark. Lighten this up a little bit. Now it's not moving as much because this paper is moving into a semi-wet state. There's a little bit of a cast shadow this guy, so there's a little bit of a darker edge right through there because that's this casting shadow onto there. And so yeah, as we're doing this, we're just going to keep on keeping on. Again, this has just a tiny bit more dark. I gotta be careful with this, it doesn't go too dark, but there's a tiny bit more darkening and there's a core shadow. So I'm going to darken right along where the light and shadow meet just a scotch, not too much, to indicate, hey, yeah, cast shadow. Or not cast shadow, core shadow. Core shadows are where the object, the light and shadow come together. So we're going to go ahead and leave that to go ahead and dry. And this would be our basic painting of the lime. I could also, when it dried, I'd come back here and maybe this is too, not dark enough, so I could darken that. Any of the edges that, if I start doing it now, it might start to bloom, but I could come back later, or if I figure out, if I do this, it has to be a thirsty brush. Somewhere between a thirsty brush and a dry brush. A thirsty brush, I can't form the brush right. But even the dry brush, you gotta be really careful, because if you do this, and if you're not careful, it can mess things up. So I'm just pulling that little bump out of there just a tiny bit. It's also pulling off paint. So see, there was a, for everything we do, there is a price to be paid, and that was the price I paid. I got the better shape on the outside, but now I lightened it on the inside. So because I was using that dry brush, it sucked up some of that paint. Then I really can't play with it anymore. I really have to leave that. If I don't, I'm gonna wish I had. So again, this was our little painting of the lime. If you got the wall, there's just again an off-white sort of color. It's basically mostly brown, Payne's gray, and the tiniest touch of yellow. We have the cast shadow down here, again mostly Payne's gray, a little bit of green mixed in a couple places. It got a little splotchy, so once this dries, I can re-wet this whole area and see if I can kind of move the paint around a little bit and drop some paint in that area. Not a big deal. But yeah, go ahead and give this a try. Try to paint the lime in watercolor. All right. Thank you for joining me. You guys have a good one. Bye-bye now.